When I was a kid, my parents told me that it's impolite to talk about yourself. It's rude and it's gauche, and it makes you look pompous and self-centered. And to a certain extent, that's true. But a part of what connects us as human beings is our ability to share stories, including our own. Billions of people have lived on this planet, and not one of them has had the exact same life. That's obvious, right? I mean, we know that that's true. But we tend to overlook that fact when it comes to average, everyday people. We minimize their existence while at the same time celebrating athletes and celebrities and people who we have been told have made a difference and have a story worth hearing. We decide if a stranger's life has worth or not. It's often an unconscious choice, but it does happen. We are told, this person is interesting, this person is important, this person has a story worth hearing, when in fact, the opposite is true. Everyone has an interesting story to tell, and if we listen, those ordinary stories can fundamentally change our lives. Sharing stories is a behavior that goes all the way back to the first people. Before there were paper and pens, there were oral traditions. Oral traditions are the means in which a society passed on its culture from generation to generation. Elders of the tribe would verbally share the history, tradition, beliefs, and culture with the younger generation in order to preserve it and ensure that it carried on. Sharing stories was everything. Not sharing a story meant that it could be lost forever, a piece of a culture forgotten. But with the invention of things like literacy and the printing press, we no longer had to verbally share our stories. They could be preserved in more permanent, less personal ways. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying books are bad. We're in a library. I'm just saying that a part of the human experience is verbally sharing our stories, using them to connect us, to bind us together, to teach, and to inspire. It can be difficult to take an interest in people we don't know. Our lives are so busy and chaotic that we often get swept up in that and lose some of that personal connection. A part of making that change is taking the time to talk to, but more importantly, listen to other people. You'd be amazed at what you can learn when you just take the time to listen to someone. Share your story. Let others share theirs with you. Everyone has an interesting story to tell. When I was 16, I read my first biography. It was called Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend. I was obsessed with Jim Morrison in high school. I grew my hair out, I listened to a ton of The Doors, I read his poetry, I watched that Oliver Stone movie a bunch of times. I was obsessed. I tried to model myself after Jim Morrison. Needless to say, I was pretty cool, and definitely not an insufferable teenager. From reading that book, I realized not only how cool I was, but also that I had an interest in hearing other people's stories. From there, I began to read primarily nonfiction and biographies and autobiographies. Flash forward a few years, I'd read about a dozen books about professional wrestlers, books about Hollywood stuntmen, books about whales and their environment. I'd even read a really interesting book about the world of horse breeding. From there, I decided to read more stories about the people who inspired me. People like Howard Hughes and Malcolm X, Ernest Shackleton and Jacques Cousteau, Nelson Mandela and Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas. All of their stories were amazing, and I did enjoy them, but at a certain point, I grew bored of reading about celebrities who had lived lives that I couldn't relate to. It was then that a spark was lit within me. I decided I wanted to learn more about average, ordinary people. Now, I hate to use that word to describe people, though, because as I've learned, everyone is extraordinary in their own way. It would take me some time to figure out exactly what that meant for me, but I would get there eventually, though the road wasn't always easy. 2 years ago, I'd just been dumped by a woman I intended on marrying on the day I was going to buy her wedding ring. Whoops, kind of misread that, right? I can laugh about it now, but at the time, it put me in a pretty dark spot. I realized I couldn't keep sleepwalking through my life anymore. I had to make a change. So I made some pretty big life-altering decisions. Among other things, I decided to start a weekly podcast showcasing everyday people's life stories. I wanted to create an environment where people could feel comfortable talking about themselves, sharing their story, preserving their history. People share the most inspiring, uplifting, tragic, heartbreaking stories I've ever heard. Each person I interview shows me a different perspective and a life that's completely different from mine. It's made me more empathetic, it's made me a better listener, and it's led to some pretty incredible things. I created an opportunity that in turn created more opportunities. It's easily the most rewarding thing I've ever done. It's the whole reason I'm here talking to you today. I've learned a lot of lessons from that show, but of course, the biggest one is that everyone has an interesting story to tell. The term sonder from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows is defined as the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and as complex as our own, populated with their own ambitions, friends, worries, routines, and inherited craziness. An epic story continuing invisibly around us like an anthill sprawling deep underground, with elaborate passageways to thousands of lives you'll never know existed. Lives in which you might appear only once, as an extra sipping coffee in the background, as a blur of traffic on a busy highway, as a lighted window at dusk. I love that. I love the idea that all around us, people are living their lives creating these amazing moments that most of us will never know existed. Sometimes the lines of our lives overlap, such as right now, only to separate again forever. There's a good chance that you won't meet even 1% of the world's population. That's 7 million people. I have 200 Facebook friends. It's incredible that we all live in our own reality, creating our own experiences, and that's basically what separates us and combines us together. Take the time to listen to people, get to know people. As I said, everyone has an interesting story to tell. According to the Population Reference Bureau, there have been approximately 107 billion people to live on this planet. When I researched that, I typed in, how many people have lived on Earth? As if somehow there was like another place that people have lived. 107 billion people, and not one of them has had the exact same life. There have been similarities, sure, but not one has been exactly the same. You control that. You guide and you shape that. You and your decisions are the thing that makes your life different from mine. What's incredible is that there are only a finite amount of things that people can experience. That number is astronomical, sure, but it is finite. And what we as human beings do is we select experiences, both voluntarily and involuntarily, and we create a story out of it. Now, I realize that's a very binary, simplified way of talking about the majesty of life, but isn't that what it all basically boils down to? Sometimes we have control over it, and sometimes something happens that dramatically alters the shape and direction of our lives forever. An accident, the death of a loved one, landing your dream job, meeting the love of your life. Each thing we do is another stitch weaved into the beautiful, complicated, fascinating tapestry of our lives. I believe that human beings are inherently creative. We pride ourselves on our ability to create something out of nothing. And that's not just true when it comes to things like music and art. It's also true for our lives. Some people are more conscious of this and strive to make their story exciting or interesting for those that would listen. Others go for safety and security. And there's nothing wrong with either of those things. Whatever is best for you is the thing you should be doing. Life is too short to live a life you're unhappy with. Be honest with yourself. If there are things in your life that you want to change and you can change them, then do it. If you're unhappy with the direction of your life or the narrative you're creating, try your best to correct it. Each thing we do is another line written into the story of our lives, and we can take that story wherever we want. Look in the media. Some of the biggest feel-good stories are about people who came from nothing to something, took their lives from negative to positive. We celebrate that. It's an inspiring thing. Those people out there lift us up and make us feel like we can conquer the world. I'm here to tell you, though, that those people don't just exist out there. They're right here in this room. Each and every single person here has an experience that someone else can relate to. The nature of those experiences and the way that they experience them might be completely different, but the relatable core of it is the same. Deep down, we all know that we're interesting. We all have something to share. We all draw from the same well of experiences, but sometimes the most negative of those can leave us feeling alone, especially when we have no control over whether we experience them or not. Anxiety, depression, loneliness, fear. These are all things that shackle us and tell us that we're not interesting or we have nothing to contribute. It can be very easy to fall into that trap. But what I've learned is that by hearing someone talk about an experience that you can relate to, it helps remind you that you are not alone. Hearing someone share their story and knowing that they came out the other side of it in one piece will heal you. That's the power of sharing your story. If you take away anything from this today, take away this. You in the audience and you at home watching online, you are unique and original. Your story is one of a kind and it is beautiful. And so is the story of the person sitting next to you and the person sitting next to them, and so on and so forth. And when you feel like you're not interesting or you have anything to contribute, just remember that there's someone out there who can relate to that feeling, especially the feeling of being uninteresting. Hell, when I was writing this talk, that was the biggest thing that I struggled with. Is this going to be interesting? But then I realized, isn't that what these TED Talks are all about? We gather together as a community to hear ordinary people share an insight that they've gained from their story. These are the start of a paradigm shift, a return, in a sense, to oral traditions. Simply by being here, by being a part of this, by watching this online, you're a part of that shift. So be courageous. Share your story. Let others share theirs with you. Our stories connect us and bind us together. They enrich our lives and help us form deep personal connections. They help shape our reality and can fundamentally alter it. And who knows? Maybe the next story you hear will be the one that changes yours, because everyone has an interesting story to tell. Thank you.